I'm going to see if it works on our United Way page. Yeah, that worked. On our United Way page.
So it'll push it straight to United Way, but it's not pushing it.
But it wouldn't push it to the event. So it'll let us go to the United Way page, but not the event. Good deal. All right. Well, we are up and going finally after some Facebook and Zoom technical difficulties. So sorry about the delay. That only took about 10 or 11 minutes of our time. And so we'll try to make that up. Well, good evening. My name is Matt Marshall. I'm the president and CEO of United Way of West Tennessee. And we have the privilege of sponsoring tonight's event alongside the Jackson Chamber, as well as our Jackson home. And we have been hosting Be the Change, a film series over the past couple of weeks. It's been an outdoor film series because of the pandemic. And it's been focused on this issue of racial reconciliation. And that's a very important topic in light of everything kind of transpiring in our community and across the country. And so we have had several people, ask questions of why we're talking about this particular subject. And so much of it has to do with the fact that, we tend to, as a community and a society, not talk about the hard things, not to talk about those elephants in the room. And so most of us have grown up and been told that, we shouldn't talk about, politics or talk about religion or talk about race. But if you were to ask a politician if politics is something he should talk about in public, he would say, of course I should, or he or she. Likewise, if you ask the pastor whether they should talk about religion in public, they would say, of course I should. And likewise, in this moment, with so many of our brown and Black brothers and sisters hurting, if you were to ask them if they should talk about these issues related to race, they would say, of course I should. And so it's in that light that we want to have these kind of conversations over the next several weeks. Tonight, kind of beginning by talking about addressing racism. But on the panel tonight, I'm very privileged to have on the call Professor Paul Rivas. Paul is a history professor here in Jackson at Lane College. We also have Lee Wilson. Lee is probably best known as the owner of Jackson Escape Rooms, but he is also one of the founding members of a church downtown that's been doing racial reconciliation work, multi-ethnic ministry for several years now. Miss Wendy Trice-Martin. Wendy is a longtime school teacher in the Jackson-Madison County school system, but she is also a community organizer and advocate, having hosted several African-American events that celebrate African-American history. And then also Dr. Frank Anderson. And Frank is a professor in the School of Theology and Missions at Union University, but he also is their director of the Center for Racial Reconciliation. And so we're delighted to have all of these folks on the call tonight to kind of help us talk through these issues. And so we're going to jump straight in because we've already missed a little bit of our time. But let's begin right at the beginning, talking about this issue of race and just asking the question, is race real? Is race real?
Well, man, I'll jump in. I would have to say it's real now. It's never been real before. And it's real now if for no other reason than how, and pardon this expression, the race card has been played down through the course of history. A lot of times when people think of the race card being played, they think of African Americans bringing race into play, but that's not how I'm using the term. Race was brought into play in a very interesting way in this country. Now, originally, I would say that race was not real in the sense that we understand it today. It's interesting that when I was growing up, and my father was a pastor when I was born, he taught me that biblically speaking, there were only three races, Jews, Gentiles, and Christians. And that, of course, was following along the lines of the story, and I tend to think of it as God's story, where the Bible is concerned. But I think from a historical standpoint, most scholars would agree that originally it just simply spoke to different kinds of or different categories of objects, much in the same way that we think of the different species of plants and animals. And where people were concerned, race came into play, but more so in terms of cultural differences, in much the same way that I would tend to speak to ethnicity today. But in America, it became prominent either as a means of determining who would be forced into enslavement, or as the case is now, as a matter of dealing with the repercussions, or maybe I should say the lingering effects of America's racial history. And speaking of who would be or who should be subject to slavery, it's interesting that many scholars today are having deep discussions about which came first, race or racism. And there are some very intelligent arguments that racism existed before race came into play.
Yeah, good thoughts. Wade?
I feel like I'm here as a learner as much as anything. I want to know more about that conversation. My understanding of race is that primarily race is something that is imposed on another person. It's connected to physical description and an assumption of geographic origin. And the problem with that is it is a category that is put on you rather than one that you take upon yourself, which creates all sorts of problems. But then in the history of race, there's a whole host of bad science, bad theology that mixes with bad politics and bad economics to create systems and structures that define Black people specifically and brown people specifically as inferior to white people. So whether it's hack science of measuring cranium sizes or the length of neck, or talk about the bile in the blood, or all of these wild kind of theories, or whether it's a incorrect association of Noah's curse of Ham and the servanthood that was going to follow his family as being something that's associated with a darkening of the skin. It's all bad. And then when the politicians and the economics get involved, all of a sudden that is comported into a hierarchy, a structure, where by definition there are better races and worse races. And that's an ideal hierarchy to have, right? If you need to figure out how to own other people and put them in your servanthood and working your fields. And that's the history that we have in the West, and specifically here in America and in the South, is people using the concept of race to suppress other people and own other people for their own financial gain. And so, should race be a category? Well, no, it shouldn't. It's a bad category, an incorrect and inaccurate category, I think. But it's very real historically and devastating historically, obviously.
Yeah. So both of you, Audrey Smetley, who wrote Race in North America, Origin and Evolution of a Worldview. You both have kind of spoken to that idea that really this idea of race is just that. It's an idea. It's ideology. It's a worldview. And she wrote specifically that it was a recent invention and that it was essentially a folk idea. That, Frank, to your point, that it wasn't really grounded in any science or anything like that. And Lee, to yours, that it was really more created for the subjugation of a particular people group. And so let's talk a little bit more about that, Paul and Wendy. Lee kind of touched a little bit on that at the end. What was really the true purpose of constructing this idea of race?
Well, I feel that race was constructed or created for a political purpose. It was created to make one group of people feel more superior to another group of people. I think it was created to give power to white people over non-white people. Throughout history, you know, it was always the dark race was the slaves of the lighter race. You know, even in when the British and the colonies they were developing North America, Native Americans were pushed off their land, and the Europeans arrived, the Dutch, the Germans, the French. They were all fighting for control. You know, they were fighting against Native Americans. They were also fighting to control the slave trade, and the white indentured servants that came over. They were building relationships with African slaves and Native Americans. So basically, in my opinion, it was that white people were basically looking for the pure race. You know, they didn't want to associate with anybody of African descent or Indian blood. So there was, you know, just separate. It was sort of a superiority type thing, you know. So, you know, even if you get into, you know, the races, they couldn't even marry interracial couples, you know, throughout the years, you know, even in the States, it was a while before the mixing of races could even marry. So I think it's, you know, a superiority. It's forced.
Yeah, for sure. Paul?
Yeah, to add with that, I mean, a lot of these points are kind of overlap, but to take it even a step further, it was about political control, but it was also about economic control, social control. And I would take it even further than the white, because it's originally started as white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant is the dominant, and we're going to control that system as best we can, which then, if you create the system of racism, then wiping out the Indian, the Native American is okay, because they're too primitive to survive in this modern world, so they're due to be eliminated. We can do that. The African is too primitive, so we can use them as slaves. It sets up the excuse for that. It wasn't right. And anyone, even in that time period, there's that excuse, well, everyone was doing it type of thing. Well, not everyone was doing it. That's kind of a cop-out now. Most of it was ethically wrong then, it still is. But when you create this story long enough and you put it into place, and you don't allow Africans to be educated, then they look like they're not educated. Well, they're not educated because you weren't giving them an education. And we don't talk about the successes of all these civilizations that end up getting wiped out in North America. So it's part of this oppression system. You have to create the social hierarchy. You have to install that system of privilege to do the things that this country did. And we don't realize the depths of it, I don't think. I don't think we teach it enough to realize how entrenched it is and how this country was created. I mean, you think about it, and I argue with my students about this. A lot of them say, throw out the Constitution. The Constitution sucks, you know, it's horrible. Look at all the things. The writing, the words are not bad. All men are created equal is actually a beautiful thing. We leave out the fact, but except those people and those men and those men and those women, and, you know, and we don't realize that whole backstory to the degree that we implemented this system. The eugenics thing was touched upon. This idea of the, you know, originally white wasn't even white. I mean, white was the Anglo-Saxon. The Southern European was not really fully white. The Eastern European was not fully white. The Catholic was not considered, you know, assimilatable. The Jew wasn't, you know, allowed in. It was a very exclusive white club in the beginning, and over the centuries, that kind of opens up more and more.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to touch on that in just a little bit, but yeah, absolutely. So, you know, both Wendy, you and Paul kind of touch on this idea that, you know, one of the main reasons that this idea of race is propped up is for political benefit, for economic benefit, both of which primarily, at least in the South, comes through the practice of chattel slavery, right? The owning of people and using them to increase your wealth through the production of cotton and other types of resources.
Can I say
So
one thing quick on that?
go for it. Go for it.
Coming from the north, a lot of times, you see this, oh, those southern whites are this, those southern whites are that. Okay, let's throw the northern whites in.
Yeah.
The blacks were also used as strike breakers to create that animosity against them in the industrial period. Oh, you want to strike against me? Well, I can replace you in a minute with black strikers. The white workers turn against social control. They turn against their black brothers instead of the people controlling the scenes.
Absolutely. So using people of color as a pawn.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, getting to this idea of the use of people of color, because, as both of you mentioned too, initially when slavery really was first instituted in America, there were Irish men who were also slaves initially. There were Native Americans who were slaves. So it wasn't just Black people, it wasn't just African descendants, even though we were by and large the majority, right? Frank, Paul, talk about how did slavery itself actually reinforce these ideas of racial superiority?
Well, think of it this way. If a group has decided that they need slaves for whatever purpose, but particularly for economic purposes, and have determined that a certain group of other people will be slaves, you almost have to dehumanize that group in some way in order to get widespread approval of enslavement. And when your preachers are preaching purported points of biblical justification from the pulpit in favor of slavery, you're inclined to move forward with slavery. So you bring that group of people you've chosen to enslave into a particular land or a particular nation, having stripped them of their given names, having stripped them of their culture, their families, any kind of legal recourse or legal protection or any opportunities for education. And then you turn around and compare their manner of adjusting in this nation, having been stripped of everything, which except for the grace of God, and I must say the resilience of those people who are enslaved, you compare them with the majority of people in that nation and how they're faring as the majority culture. And they further look as though they are inferior. And when that majority senses all of this as being a function of manifest destiny, in part because of their economic success, the concept of racial inferiority of the slaves heightens the sense of the racial superiority of the majority culture. And all of a sudden, this cycle, if you will, starts all over. And every time the cycle is repeated, the sense of superiority of the majority race and inferiority of the oppressed group just intensifies.
Paul?
Yeah, to piggyback onto that, because of the nature of the slavery that this country developed, white supremacy was absolutely necessary to do what was done for the length of period of time that it was done. You couldn't do that if I'm looking at you as a brother or sister or fellow human. You have to be much less than me for me to do that. I mean, think about it. It's systematic rape. It's systematic torture. It's systematic murder. Except the psychopath, that's not something we can do to one another if we see us as all brothers and sisters. So you have to dehumanize, as Frank said, you have to dehumanize them to such a degree that this is okay. You hear people talk about, they're almost better off being, or they are better off being slaves. And one of my side interests is collecting old historical books. And I had this book from the 1860s, and this Northern Copperhead wrote about the history of Africa without going to Africa. But it shows the mindset. He said, I have friends that have visited Africa. In Africa, they're just running around slaughtering each other, eating each other. They're better off slaves. We are starting with almost like children and raising them to be human beings, which is the furthest thing from the truth. But you need that kind of thing advanced among enough people that this is okay. Otherwise, it's just not okay. You can't accept the horrendous things that were done. And a lot of times, Americans, especially white Americans, when they try to justify it, you hear that, well, everyone had slavery. Slavery goes back to biblical times. The traditional slavery was you defeat me in war and you take me as a slave. Now, you might treat me bad for a while, but you still see me as a human being. And if I serve you well, I might even marry your daughter if I'm young enough and become part of the family, and I'm going to be freed. But this idea that, I'm going to be enslaved and all of my kin from now on forever in perpetuity is going to be enslaved. That is not the type of slavery you see around the world. That's a type that was created very unique and very barbarous, and it needed white supremacy. Otherwise, it starts to fall apart.
Yeah. So there, this idea that chattel slavery in and of itself was a unique type of slavery that really hadn't pre-existed anywhere in the world, and to some degree. And this notion, this reality that in America, people of African descent were legally deemed to be, as you have both spoken to, only 1/3 human beings, right? So they weren't even completely human. And Paul, to your point, you kind of have to do that to allow your conscience to be okay with what's transpiring every day. And so it's this same kind of idea we hear about in Nazi Germany in the concentration camps, that Jews were not seen as humans. So the SS officers could not view them as humans. Otherwise, if they did, they would not have been able to perpetrate those atrocities. So they had to dehumanize them. They had to see them as less than human, just so in their conscience, they could permit themselves to do what was being done. So we've talked a bit about slavery and how this really kind of set the tone for all of this. But we hear the types of comments quite often. That was 150 years ago, right? The abolition of slavery in 1865, that solved that, right? So let's go there. Wendy, why did that not solve the problem? Why did the abolition of slavery not solve the problem? Why are we still talking about this today?
Because we're still talking, we're still here, we're still fighting for racial equality. We're still fighting for justice today. That's why we're having this conversation, to better understand each other. And the more we talk, maybe we can have better solutions, better race relations. And so we have to start somewhere. So why not start with the conversation? Even racial equality and justice, it didn't happen. The white and Black abolitionists, they fought against slavery. They had all sorts of groups that fought. A war was fought. It still didn't end. The 13th Amendment passed, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The first civil rights bill was even passed, giving all people inalienable rights. But African Americans were supposed to be given citizenships. The Freedmen's Bureau was started. Schools were started for children. And then what happened? Still nothing. Big Black codes. They even had to create codes to try to govern people. And then you go into Jim Crow. Then there was the Great Migration. That the Harlem Renaissance grew from that. And then lynchings became more prevalent. So even in the 50s and 60s, people had to have a green book to even travel throughout, to give them safe housing and where to go get gas and eat at restaurants. And then the civil rights era. And where are we today? Still fighting for social justice, still fighting for equal rights, still fighting for fair housing, still fighting for, employment. And, here we are, still involved in racial protests today, even in streets all over America.
Yeah.
Still protesting, still fighting.
Yeah. Lee, what would you add to that?
Yeah, the core problem has always been that Black people were defined and redefined as less than and less deserving of true equality, true equity with white people. And the Declaration of Abolition, the Emancipation Proclamation, from day one, it was delayed, right? The proclamation was made in September of 1862, didn't go into effect until the start of 1863. And then it took a couple of years before it even extended through the South, and it's celebrated on Juneteenth now. Slavery and racial inequity, racism has often been compared to cancer. And when I think about the battle against racism, I think about my mom, who came down with leukemia about 3 years ago. And the kind of leukemia that she had, there was a malignant cell inside of her bone marrow that would just produce and produce and produce and produce, and would flood the body and flood the bone marrow with all of these cells. And so the doctors would go in and they would eradicate it with chemotherapy. The problem is that the chemotherapy would just kill the active living cells. There were cells that were dormant, that were missed by the chemo. And after a few weeks, few months of her, being good and healthy, all of a sudden, all of those cancer cells would spring up and start working again. And it's like, the abolition of slavery is a wave of chemotherapy that comes across. And then the malignancy that is the cancer, that is racism, will come up in another way. So it comes up as the Black codes. And then, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed, and it, kills the Black codes. But, the dormant cells spring up, and all of a sudden it's Jim Crow. And that's just the story of this, on and on and on and on. And for my mom, who's doing well now, what they had to do is a bone marrow transplant, which means that they killed every bone marrow cell in her body, and they put in a completely different set of cells to set up and begin a whole new immune system in her body. And that process is described as a civil war inside of your skin, inside of your person. And I feel like the reason that the abolition of slavery didn't solve a problem fundamentally is that we had a civil war on the outside that left hundreds of thousands dead. We didn't have the civil war that we really needed, the internal civil war where racism, not just slavery, is eradicated.
Mm.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
So, as both of you have kind of spoken to, slavery was abolished, but not the root issue of what even, created slavery, what set the precedent for it, which was the racism itself. We see so many of our Christian brothers and sisters say it's a sin issue, right? And they're not wrong in that. But that we can tend to hear that said, and then it not actually address, Lee, the very thing that you're talking about. And as you guys kind of talked about just then, Lee especially, both of you, part of what also was at play in all of this is that racism kept recreating itself over time, right? It evolved, essentially. And that really is kind of true of really our understanding of race as a society, right? So Paul, Frank, Paul, you mentioned this, you started to talk about this a few minutes ago, but how really did our understanding of race change? The notion of what it really, meant to be an American. You spoke about, this, historically, our Eastern European brothers and sisters, Italians, again, Irish Catholics in particular, other groups of folks who now, today we consider white. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, the 1920s, during the mass immigration in, New York, those groups of people were not considered American or white. So how did that change? What's changed?
Well, I would say the biggest change has been we've kind of filled up our country. We don't have the mass immigration. So we've kind of regrouped who belongs and who doesn't. And from there, now we've kind of redefined. In certain ways, like one of the big historical lies I teach about in US history is the melting pot never really was a melting pot. Eventually, if you were white, you would make the cut to get into the pot, but those first generations weren't getting into the pot. The Catholics and the Jews, well, what happens is down the road, all of a sudden you can't tell that I'm Catholic or that I'm Jewish, or maybe I've anglicized my name, and once you see that I'm just like you, pretty soon those stigmas of ethnicity kind of eroded away, but the color always stayed. It's always been, you can't get away from the color. You can't assimilate because you're the wrong color for this country. And it was defined as a white country, which it never was. First of all, it was a Native American country to begin with, and the African contributed against their will, but they contributed massively to the economic growth of this country, but don't get any credit for that. Just the white slave owners get credit for making the money. It's like, you didn't make the money, you didn't grow anything. So the story kind of emerges out of that. But certain underlying things, I would say, we're still as bad as we ever were. And all it takes is to look at the kids in cages on the border. That should be abhorrent to anybody, but we've labeled them as illegals. They're not human beings. Let's call them illegals. And then what happens to illegals? They go to jail, so it's okay to put these people in prisons. We're still heavily nativist. We're still heavily xenophobic. That's been coming out, especially these last few years. That emerging trend, we have to see that, we have to recognize that and move away from that consciously, because it's too easy to fall into that trap and say, wait a minute, no, those are human beings. The whole murderers and rapists and drug dealers are coming across the border. A lot of them are refugees. To get back to one, to kind of wrap my side of this up, to get back to one of the points you brought up about the 20s, most Americans don't realize that was the largest by far growth of the KKK. The Klan was not a Southern thing anymore in the 20s. It was a Northern thing too, because they lashed back against the immigrant scourge that was ruining America and that was un-American. These people come over here with their belief systems that are wrong. A lot of them took up socialism because they were being exploited. It wasn't because I'm going to go to America and undermine the American system. They came here for a better life and realized, I'm not getting the better life. I'm working, 14 hours a day to be in poverty. I thought all men were created equal and things like that. So we have a narrative of the way the country is perceived, which it never was, which is a problem. They give us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to be free. That was only as long as we had factories to put them into. As soon as we didn't have the jobs, look at every period of American history, they slammed the door on those people and said, get out. Not just we don't want any more, but if you just came here, you're not welcome anymore.
Yeah. Frank?
Well, back in February, I spent 12 hours one weekend in a car with Paul Rivas. It was supposed to be about 10 hours, but it ended up being 12. And one of the things that I learned from that is never follow Paul Rivas when you get an answer. So I'm tempted to say ditto and let us move on, but the preacher in me just won't allow me to do that. But let me preface my answer to the question by saying that when I talk with white Americans who profess having life in Christ about white privilege, I talk to them about thinking about white privilege more in terms of God's sovereignty than thinking in terms of guilt. Because thinking of it in that manner kind of presses the issue of responsibility to God, what begs the question of what am I going to do with my privilege? But even if your faith position is not rooted in Christ, I think a good starting point for understanding white privilege is to think about it in the context of how in virtually any structure, the majority culture becomes the dominant culture, especially if the majority culture involves 70% of the population. Now, why am I talking about privilege and majority culture here? Well, I think that kind of leads to the understanding of, as you have an influx of immigrants coming into the picture, especially when Anglo-Saxons are considered to be or to approximate the majority culture than those who are not Anglo-Saxons, you have to stress that people who do not approximate that majority are non-Americans. And you have to limit their presence in America. And you may even go to the extent of barring their presence in America. Otherwise, the majority status of the majority culture becomes threatened. From a Christian standpoint, I rejoiced over a statistic I saw a few days ago. I even think I posted something on my Facebook page about this. But every year there are these estimates of our census status, even in terms of race and ethnicity. And this year's estimate, even though we're in the middle of a 10-year census, this year the estimate indicated that for the first time in America, the majority of people in this country under the age of 16 are non-white. That excites me from the standpoint of what it means for our churches, what it means for our country. But you better believe that there are some people who view that statistic or read that statistic, and there's nothing joyful about it to them. They read into it that the culture is changing, and I'm enjoying this majority status. If for no other reason than that, I don't want to see it change. And change is on the way. So it doesn't surprise me when people make moves to try to limit the change in the racial status, and immigrants coming in who are not Anglo-Saxons pose that particular threat and lead to folks feeling that they have to make those moves against them coming in. So that's my way of saying ditto to what Paul just said.
Yeah, so this idea that, Paul, you had mentioned, we often have talked about America as if it's a melting pot. But the reality is that it's more like a salad plate with ranch poured all over it, right? And so, but, Frank, to your point in that, the reason why we talked about America as a melting pot is because you did have this nation where you had all of these different ethnic groups come together. But to both of your points, we really didn't come together. We have coexisted to a degree, and sometimes not that well. Paul, even as you talked about the rise of the KKK in the 1920s, so there's been this change that's been afoot for a while, right? So, it's taken us years to get to this point that you're talking about, Frank, where now the majority of young people in this country are people of color. But, as we kind of think about the 20th century, particularly the second half, after the civil rights movement, as we transition into the 70s and 80s and the 90s, I think there are a lot of people in the country who would kind of have this sentiment, the Cosby era of people, right? Cosby TV show era of people, that there, where there were some great advancements, during that second part of the century. That people of color really were able to kind of move forward in some ways that hadn't been true, historically. But again, here we are having this conversation. So Wendy, Paul, what were we missing? What were we missing, if anything?
Well, I think that Black people were underrepresented in jobs, in the sciences, in technology, in engineering, math jobs where you get all the money. Education, economics, we faced a lot of obstacles, getting better paid jobs. I think education had a lot to do with it. There were a lot of more programs that allowed people to uplift themselves and to better educate themselves, and those programs went away. Industry, economics affected it. There were a lot of Blacks that went into industry. They're working into jobs, and what happens? The industry closes, or they get promotions because they're not qualified. So education had a lot to do with it. Pay inequality. I think that fewer employee benefits were often, we didn't get those benefits as our white brothers and sisters. So today we still need to improve more in education, create more employment opportunities, more skills, because everybody's not going to go to college, but we need to have skills. All those programs were taken out of the schools, and so I remember when I was in high school, we did have different things that young people could go in. They had auto mechanics, they had welding, they had all those things, but all those things left. So that's what we're missing: education, economics.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, you made some good points, like the Cosby thing, that those things happen, that Cosby type family. But the thing is, it's kind of back to the white privilege. That's an uphill battle. There's some that succeeded, but they had to overcome so much that wasn't the norm. We still have the problems of, it's a very emotionally loaded word, but I think it's still appropriate. The ghettoization of the African American, restricting them from where they could live, having to pay more for your house and having to pay more for your interest just by the color of your skin. It didn't matter that you had a better job than me. If you were Black and I'm white, you're a high risk. And even though I might be the high risk, my skin gets me out of it. Americans don't realize that isn't a Southern thing. That was a across the country thing. The open housing marches in Milwaukee. I used to show my class when I taught up there, the open housing marches in Milwaukee. And the South Side whites came out with Klan outfits, swastikas, met them at the bridges and said, "You're not coming into our neighborhoods." And my students' response was like, "Oh my God, why didn't my parents ever tell me about this stuff?" I'm very sarcastic, so I just have to bite my tongue. It's like, probably because your parents might be in the videos, at least some of them. We don't realize that. And getting back to the job thing, my family comes from blue collar, and there was that upward mobility that the immigrant had, that they came here with nothing, but their kids would have more, and their kids would have more, and their kids would have more. And pretty soon they're in the middle class or the upper class. And my grandfather started as a floor worker at GM and was in management when he left Cadillac later. African Americans finally start getting in the door just as we deindustrialize. So that upward mobility model was taken away. And I really hate when, the white people that want to defend things will say, "Well, what's wrong with Black people? My family came over here with nothing, and look, I've got this." It's like, you didn't live in the same world that they lived in. You didn't have access to those jobs, and they were gone. And then the lack of education that was given, the public education system was second rate in a lot of these places. And the other thing that's often overlooked is the Highway Act of the 50s and 60s. When we created the highway system, if there were successful Black neighborhoods and cities, that's where almost all the freeways went through. So even the little bit of scraping up to take your family to the next level was often wiped out because, no, we're not going to go through the white upper class or middle class neighborhood. They almost always went through the Black neighborhood. So any possible success was wiped out. There's no, except for maybe the Native American who had just been marginalized to the reservation, there's no other group that every time they start to get up off their knees, they get knocked all the way back down to the ground and are starting from the bottom again. And that's what's different than these other models. So when you look at it, the Black experience is totally different than any other. To compare them, well, I came from some of the poorest. I mean, I'm Ukrainian. They're pretty poor immigrants, but that's not a model that's even close to the African-American model because of all those things. There's no accumulation of wealth over the generations that most groups have got to do in this country.
And I think, one of the things you're highlighting there that often doesn't get brought up in this conversation is trauma, right? So the historical and generational trauma that people have gone through and that go through. And so I was speaking with a group yesterday. One of the hot button topic issues in our country is ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And science has shown that when children are exposed to trauma in their youth, especially large doses of it, it literally changes them biologically. And so when we have whole neighborhoods of people who have faced trauma, I'm reminded of Angela Davis's interview when she was in jail, and she was asked about violence. And one of her responses was she grew up in Birmingham, and she said, those 4 little girls that got killed in the bombing in the church in Birmingham, they were my neighbors, literally. They were literally, one of the girls lived next to her. And she said, I knew their family. And she said, I grew up in Birmingham with the sounds of bombs as a regular, normal thing. So think about communities growing up with that trauma. And so, the ability for anybody to come out of that as a success is remarkable. And we don't normally, tend to view it that way. So, let's transition for a second, to the present. Lee, Frank, what does racism look like in 2020? What does that look like? Why are we having this conversation, today?
Well, one of the most eye-opening things that I've learned about, and really since George Floyd was murdered, has been reading Ibram X. Kendi's books. And one of the things that he brings to the forefront of this conversation is the idea that, using the noun racist is not very helpful, because just about everybody can imagine somebody that's more racist than them, right? So if you lived in a neighborhood in Birmingham, you could walk the streets and say, well, I would never throw a stick of dynamite at somebody's house. So I'm not the problem. They're the problem. I'm not the problem. And it's really easy for us to carry that same, and when I say us there, I'm very specifically meaning white people. It is very easy for white people to carry around that same mentality of, I know somebody, or I've heard of somebody who is actively working to subjugate Black people and brown people, and I'm not doing that. So, I'm not the problem. And, one of the ways that we see racism at work right now, especially in white people, is the assumption that is, I think, an unthinking assumption, and I say that from personal experience, that assimilation is the golden rule of American success. Right? If people can become more like me and conform to, my culture, number one, like that they have that ability, it's just easy as a white person who does have a lot of the luxuries of history in their favor to assume that everybody has that same access, the same ability to step into the kinds of things that I've gotten to do in my life. And honestly, for the first 28 years of my life, I was very, very unaware that I had any kind of privilege, any kind of advancement over anybody else. And so I carried the mindset of looking around and just assuming that other people could do the same kinds of things. And when you make that assumption, you're prone to interpret the actions of other people as failures on their part. Failures of character, failures of perseverance, failures of their family background. And the sickening thing is that a lot of those are racist ideas that had been passed along for years and years and years and years. And over time, you figure out more polite ways to have those conversations. But at the heart, when you talk about, as an example, a neighborhood as being a dangerous place, there's a coding that goes with that. And that coding is that is a poor place, that is a Black place, that is a place that you can't go as a white person because you will stick out and you don't belong. And all of those things are incredibly dangerous. And I'll pass it off to, I think, Frank, right? Or Wendy? I don't remember who's supposed to go next.
So, Frank, you're up.
Now, when I look at racism today, I guess I take something of a two-dimensional approach to my perspective. I'll give you the positive and the negative. Positively, I would say that now racism is uglier than it's ever been before. That's the positive, that it's uglier than ever. I say that because more people see it as being ugly today. Just looking at everybody in this group, if I were a gambling man, and I'm not, but if I were a gambling man, I'd be willing to bet. I don't know, Paul's got me shaking on this one a little bit, but I'd be willing to bet that I'm the oldest in this particular group. I was born in 1960. And so I can't tell you how refreshing it is today to sit in this discussion with Lee Wilson and Paul Rivas and hear them very clearly and effectively articulate the problems with racism. And I'm glad that it looks pretty ugly today to people aside from African Americans engaged in the protests that we see today. A few weeks ago, we had a justice walk at Union, and planners of that particular event were willing to accept, well, hey, if 50 people show up, that we'll take that and go. And according to the media, we had over 600 people involved, but the overwhelming majority of those folks were white and they were young. And so I'm glad to see it looking so ugly at this point in time. That's the first dimension. The second dimension, though, has to do, and I think Lee touched on this well, with the fact that racism is so systemic. I think not only did Lee touch on this in his answer that he just gave to this particular question, but even the analogy from his mom's challenge with cancer kind of speaks to the problem that we have with systemic racism. It also speaks to the issue that was well addressed earlier about why slavery didn't end with why racism didn't end with the abolition of slavery. I think there are too many people who do not understand systemic racism. I think there are too many people, particularly in the white community, who feel that when we talk about systemic racism, that necessarily means that you're saying that all white people are racist. That's not true, and I'm going to get in trouble for what I'm about to say. But this is the best way that a simpleton like me knows how to make this particular point. I just mentioned a moment ago how refreshing it was to see the number of white people that showed up for that justice walk. Now, I want any white listeners or viewers of this to understand that kind of participation is absolutely necessary. And I hope it increases as time goes on. But without there being, in my opinion, anyone in that group who I would label as racist, you still saw systemic racism even with that. When I was growing up, there used to be a saying in the African American community that it ain't so until the white man says so. And pressing these issues of inequality did not start with the situation with law enforcement. These issues have been pressed for a long time, but it's really not until the majority culture or the majority race takes this up, that you can really see any real impetus involved, except for that provided by God himself. So the negative side of it is that systemic racism is still around. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're also seeing a heightening of animosity about discussions concerning race. It's almost necessary that we go through that. It's pardon the implicit pun here, but people who have racist attitudes, people who are racist, you will see in 2020 and going forward, them show their true colors a little bit more on this. So seeing situations of people talking about white power and a lot of women these days asserting their purity where their American citizenship is concerned and the purity of the white race. It's almost an imperative in order for us to go forward. And even though I started out with the positive being viewed as it being uglier than ever before, the negative is the systemic racism is coming through in stronger ways than ever. So I kind of, when I look at racism in this year and think about it going forward, I have to look at it from both of those perspectives.
Yeah, so, both of you kind of talk, essentially about this idea of privilege, right? And so, Frank, there's a lot of truth in what you just shared in that, if you ask a lot of people of color, many of them will say, one of the reasons we're doing this is because this moment feels different, right? That's what everyone says. Mm-hmm. But why does it feel different? It's because of what you just said. Because for the first time in a long time, really since the civil rights movement, you had white brothers and sisters at those marches. You had white brothers and sisters holding those signs alongside of us. And that's what has made this feel different. But that in and of itself, as you just showed and as Lee spoke about too, is the perfect example of privilege. Mm-hmm. That we didn't feel like a country, we didn't feel as though we could really move forward until the majority said we could, until they also got on board. And again, let's be honest, that's not so unlike the civil rights movement, right? We showed the film Selma this past Saturday, and that's one of the things that Dr. King and the other civil rights leaders talked about. They had to turn the hearts of the majority on that issue. And we're seeing that same thing, true today. But, as we talk about privilege, another example maybe of this that maybe, helps people understand what we mean when we use that language. Let me ask this question. Wendy, I'll start with you because you are the only sister on the call tonight. Is racism the same for men and women? And if not, how's it different? So go for it.
No, it's not the same. When I looked at the question and think about the question, it makes me almost want to go into Maya Angelou and Still I Rise, because it started on the plantation where women were taken advantage of. Women actually ran the households. They were the nannies, So as a Black woman, we face a lot of discrimination for being a woman and for being Black, and we have probably the most minimum wage jobs, and we're promoted more slowly than our Black brothers and white brothers. We're paid less than most men unless we have that great education and that power job, but even during this pandemic, it's mostly Black women that are facing the most danger of COVID because they're out on the front line. They're essential workers. They're working in the stores, they're working in the fast food restaurants. And now even in the streets, they're being confronted with violence, as they protest, for the injustices. So no, it's not the same. And as far as as a Black man, it's different for a Black man as well. A lot of times, Black men aren't hired because they are felt as they're threatened, if they're big in stature, just their look seems to intimidate some people if they're strong, so I don't know. I think Black men, they're most likely to be shot, killed by the police than Black women. They're stopped more on the streets. They're arrested more when they go in the courtroom. They're not treated the same as white men. For the same crime, they don't. They get a different sentence. Even in school, in the alternative school, it's the little Black boys that fill up those classrooms. So there is a difference. There's a difference in men and women, yes, and it's sad. Yeah. But as I started saying, and still I rise. Yeah, still we rise. Yeah.
Frank, what would you add to that?
I would say that the only way in which it is the same is found in the fact that the distinctions that Wendelin just mentioned all work together to make Black life difficult in America. That's the only way that it's the same. It's different for women because women of all colors in this country, or of all ethnicities, have had to deal with suppression, even where the issue of voting is concerned. And on top of that, or sexism in other forms, and then on top of that, being a Black woman makes things more difficult, or you can think of it as being a Black woman having sexism on top of that, making it more difficult. But one of the differences where Black men are concerned, some would argue is maybe more historic than, or historical than in play today. I don't know that I agree with that particular argument, but let me explain it this way. I'm something of a news junkie, and I think if you're going to pay any attention to the media today from a news standpoint, you owe it to yourself to look at it from all the different angles. So when my television is on, it's on Fox and it's on CNN. But when it's not on the news channels, it's typically on Turner Classic Movies. And it's interesting to watch how the old movies, I think, accurately depict the differences in the way in which racism played out with men from the way it was engaged with women. Everything that Wendelin just said is absolutely right concerning what women have had to endure and what Black women are still enduring today. But as she also pointed out, there is the fear element where Black men are concerned. I'm going to say this very quickly. I apologize before we went live about not having the opportunity to get a haircut. And that has to do with my having a kidney transplant last year. And while things are going well with COVID-19, it's been stressed on me to be careful with things, maybe a little more than other people are careful with them. And I have taken on the habit of walking every day. And I have had instances where while walking, where white people who see me on a regular basis, but are not accustomed to my hair being as long as it is, will almost cross over to the other side. And then when I get closer to them, they realize, oh, it's you. I don't want to give the impression that that's happened a lot, but it's happened enough for me to understand how historically that fear element has been there. But it's not all been about fear. If you go back to slavery and to some extent even today, there is a sense of trying to divide men and women in the Black community. And one of the ways of doing that has to do with emasculation, where women sometimes, even though not being paid fairly or paid equally, are allowed to come into certain settings with greater ease than Black women I'm referring to, than Black men. And so, no, they're not, racism is not the same between Black men and Black women, only in the sense that when you look at how it's played out on Black men and how it is engaged with Black women, the two efforts combined, plus maybe a bevy of other ways in which it plays out differently, serve to just make life for African Americans more difficult.
So, you know, as we kind of in these last few questions, we have about 20 minutes left. I'm gonna give us about 20 minutes since we got started about 10 minutes late. You know, Paul, Lee, as we kind of turn now the conversation really to think about, you know, what do we do? What's happening in this moment? Are people obligated to deal with racism, particularly our white brothers and sisters? Are they obligated to deal with it?
Let's say yes, 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 and yes. Going back to the quote attributed to Plato, you know, silence gives consent. So unless you live in a utopia where everything's okay, we need to speak out. And I think about my life as it relates to this question. A lot of times I let stuff just slide off, and I would like make that little mental note, like he's a racist. And one of the things I bring up in my classroom is the story I hate, that one that white people will tell. You know, I'm not a racist, but, and I'm about to tell you something really racist, but with that disclaimer, I get out of being a racist. And we have to say, no, that's not appropriate. And, you know, this isn't appropriate. And, you know, I take a beating for my Facebook page. Like, why do you have to be so combative? And what, you know, I don't have cats playing guitars and pianos on my Facebook page. I talk about issues because it's not that I think I'm going to change everyone's mind, but I'm going to let them know that it's unacceptable to do these certain things now. I'm not going to put up with a society that's going to pretend like it's okay. And that's where I think the white community has to play that more important role of stepping up and saying, no, even the stereotyping leads to the next step of judging people. I was at a showing for a house, and a realtor came out to meet me. He was an elderly white guy. We had a great talk, and it was really comfortable until we got to the end. He's like, what do you do? I teach. Oh, that's cool. What do you teach? History. Oh, that's really cool. Where do you teach? Lane College. And he kind of had that pause. And as we left, he comes in and he tries to do the ethnic handshake, which I've done with my friends that I'm on that kind of relationship with. I don't walk up to, and when I first met Frank, I didn't go up there, I'm going to press him with this. And he followed up with a couple other questions. And in the back of my mind, it's like, I wouldn't buy a house if he gave it to me for $1 from this guy. But I didn't say anything. We have to start turning that corner. Like, you know what? That's not acceptable. Or when people ask me, when I say I teach at Lane College, well, are you like the only white guy in the room? Are all your students Black? And I'm like, well, a lot of the times, yeah. How do you do that? Like I'm teaching Martians or something. Like they're people. I have great relationships with my students. And we have to start breaking down a lot of those barriers that we've created and put up that lead to the white privilege and all the other things.
Lee, what would you add?
Well, a lot of what I hear and see from white people who would rush to say like, well, no, I don't have any responsibility. is that they want to opt out of their place in history. And will want to redefine the situation in terms of, well, I have not done anything personally, right? Like I am in favor of multi-ethnic community, and like I see people irrespective of their skin color. I'm colorblind, and so because of that, they're off the hook, right? They may not like make that last step and say I'm off the hook, but they voice those two other things about multi-ethnicity and about being colorblind as though that means something in terms of a much larger need to solve these kind of systemic policy related issues, and that's extremely dangerous, and I think naive, and there's too much of that willful ignorance. And if we continue to go that way, if white people continue to go that way specifically, then we're not going to see massive change. It's going to take a much more strategic and panoramic sized view of the problem in order for us to move forward. And kind of to answer the question personally, one of my distant relatives is James K. Polk, who's from Tennessee and who was the 11th president of the United States and was a slave owner. And related to him was a guy named Leonidas Polk, who was a Confederate general, who evidently was not a very good general, but he was like a spiritual leader of the Confederate Army. Until he died from a cannon blowing his arm off that ricocheted off of a fortification. But that's part of my heritage genetically. And then there are also sharecroppers that are a part of my heritage genetically. And I'll have conversations even with family sometimes that will say, well, our people had a real rough go of it too. They were sharecroppers and they were out there farming the same fields and doing the same kinds of things as freed slaves. And, we've had a hard life and a hard background. And, my response to that is, well, yeah, but if you got to the end of the year as a sharecropper and you felt like the landowner had done the math wrong or wasn't paying you enough, you could have a conversation about that and not probably have to worry about being lynched for being uppity and not knowing your place. And so personally, whether you can track your family to the Confederate leadership or whether your family origins are more humble, or there's still privilege that comes with being white and being a benefactor from a system of oppression. And it is incumbent on everybody who has benefited from injustice to do something more than just do a heart check and make sure that I don't have any personal biases that really come out in obvious ways, but to go beyond that.
And that sentiment reminds me of something that Paul had mentioned, at the beginning, which is back, as the Industrial Revolution was coming to a close and we were transitioning economically, and jobs, the type of jobs began to shift. Our white brothers and sisters were being put up against people of color and immigrants and those to compete, right? There was a competition there that was created, this created sense of competition, because nobody, again, because of what we've talked about earlier in this country, we have sold this idea of the American dream of success. And so everyone wants to climb that ladder, and that has become a competition in and of itself. And so by the nature of that, you do have this sense in which white people who are poor and Black people who are poor have had many of the same exact struggles. But as James Baldwin said in his pin drop speech at Cambridge, decades ago, one of the things that our white brothers and sisters who were poor next to people of color who were poor, the one advantage that they could claim is that at least I am not Black, right? And so, you know, and that was, again, it goes back to where we started, this ideology of race. This philosophy, this worldview permitted that type of thinking. So, you know, in our modern context, in response to George Floyd, in response to so many other things that are going on and that have gone on, Frank, you know, you mentioned that, things that have happened in the past. These are not new things. These are not new issues. We have seen something rather new arise over the last several years, last 5, 6, 7 years, and that is the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So that's been kind of a new thing over the last you know, few years. You particularly see that you know, having arisen even more so, come to the forefront these last several weeks. So I want to pose this question: what does Black Lives Matter mean to you individually? Wendy, you want to give that a go to begin?
Okay. Black Lives Matter. All lives can't matter until Black Lives Matter. Years of oppression brought on by a race of people forced into slavery, this country's greatest sin. And I think of so many people that have fought throughout the years for equal rights and have fought and died for them, and we're still not where we need to be. So you can't understand our trouble, you can't understand our pain until you understand that we matter. So to me, Black lives can't matter. All lives because of Black lives, what I'm saying. So that's why we matter.
Paul, what would you say?
Very similar to that. Like, no one's really free until everyone has that basic level that they're not a target. I mean, Black skin still is a target, especially young Black males. Those are who I teach. I just had a conversation. I talk with my students a lot. I learn as much from them as they do from me, I think, sometimes. And we were just talking about life as a young person, and the one kid's like, yeah, my buddies wanted to go out. And I said, I'm not riding 4 deep in Jackson. And I had to stop. It's like, there was never a time in my life where I thought, man, I got too many white guys in this car. I got to get rid of some because that's just going to be bad. We have to get to that point where it's like, I have to act a certain way or I could have my rights infringed upon. That still is the Black experience. We have to change that. Kind of one last story. I tell a lot of stories. I was at a group thing with a bunch of different groups from our campus, and it was on, Black interactions with the police. And the guy that I was working with was talking about the talk. I remember when I got the talk, and I'm like, the talk? Why are we talking about that? We're talking about police tonight. To the average white person, the talk to me was the birds and the bees. Like, if you asked the average white person and you said, what's the talk? They'd say, oh, that's when your parents sit you down. I had no awareness that there's that sit down with your Black child and say, okay, this is what happens. This is how you have to act. Do not do this, don't do that. That means that it's a problem. Until we're all raised the same way and play by the same rules, that's when, we don't have to have Black Lives Matter, because they haven't mattered for so long. We have to get to that equality.
Yeah. And so, it's this notion, right, that Black Lives Matter is saying exactly that all lives matter. That's really what it's saying. It's just the issue has been all lives have not mattered. That's what you guys are getting at. That's been the inherent problem with the system that we've been discussing tonight. That Wendy, as you mentioned, really the sentiment behind that is that until Black people, until their lives truly matter in this country, we can't say that all lives matter.
Right.
Yeah, the very first sentence that began everything with the American Revolution is that all men are created equal.
Mm-hmm.
If that were true, we wouldn't need to be saying Black Lives Matter right now. But we do, because all lives in our country have not been treated as equal.
Yeah. So what, for people who are watching, who've been watching this, the folks in our audience, the people who will rewatch this, hopefully, later, what are practical steps that they can take to begin to address some of these issues that we've talked about tonight? Where can they start? That's the question that we're getting a lot. Where can I start? So, anyone who wants to jump in on that, where can our audience members start?
I'll jump. I'm not going to apologize for speaking from the standpoint of a Christian worldview, but I am going to speak from the standpoint of a Christian worldview. I think a good starting point is history. I graduated from high school in 1977 in Memphis. Southside High doesn't exist now. Predominantly African-American school, but I distinctly recall the amount of attention that was given in the American history textbook we used to slavery, a whopping 2 paragraphs, and not much more given to just Black life, period, where American history is concerned. So we've got a lot of people in this country who have pretty much a scintilla of a view of American history as it relates to the Black struggle, the Black contributions, the Black experience in toto. For a lot of young African Americans, I think it's precipitating frustration. When I look at the George Floyd situation, the only difference that I really see from what's been happening for all of my life is that we've got video footage of George Floyd dying. And let me throw this in as I say that. It's interesting that Martin Luther King Jr. said that the 2 greatest forces for change in terms of human agency were civil disobedience, and I wish people would underscore civil where that's concerned, and freedom of the press. Yeah. And he was speaking to people seeing some of the activity in Birmingham in response to nonviolent protests. But where freedom of the press is concerned, I think that's kind of expanded as a result of technology. So we're seeing more and more of that. And I think our young people are frustrated because they are not aware of how this has been going on for as long as it has been going on. And I think there are a lot of people who are not giving it attention in the white community because they don't understand African-American history. They don't understand, I would suggest that people think about it this way. You take a people who have been forcibly enslaved. When slavery ends, they leave with absolutely nothing. There's a Reconstruction period that comes to an end abruptly. Then you have the Black codes. Then you have the Jim Crow laws. Then you have stiff resistance to the civil rights movement. When I was born, the right to vote wasn't guaranteed to African Americans. Where would you expect a group of people to be having gone through all of that? but I don't think that historical track is understood. So what I think we need is, I think we need to give greater attention to American history in terms of the African American experience in that history. And from a Christian standpoint, I would hope that we would do that together, and just see where the Holy Spirit takes us from there. But I think history is very, very important. I think it's very convincing. I think in some instances it's very convicting as well. I think something else that has to happen, and I think some people are going to think that I've lost my mind when I've said this, after I've said this, but if you try to address racism as an African American, but with the character of Christ, you have to understand that in the sovereignty of God, you're being a part of an oppressed race is to some extent a call to work to heal the people who have wounded you. And I know that sounds crazy, Cat, but from a Christian worldview standpoint, I think it's necessary for me to take, as an African American, to take that particular position. I think we need history, and I think we just need believers to stand up and lead the way on this particular issue. That's where I think we need to start practically.
And one thing quickly on that, social media has changed the dynamic, and it's made the young people, who I still think have the energy in this, I think that is the future for us. You think about the 60s, they were marginalized. It's all those hippies, they're doing drugs, the free love, whatever. You still needed mainstream media to adopt your message back then, which you couldn't get. Today, the young people actually know how to get the message out better than the people at the networks, through social media. So we can actually have really grassroots movements starting through young people and spreading and sharing and joining groups and finding out what's happening. Where before, if I didn't know you, I might not know what's going on and what you're organizing on your side of town. Now it's just one big world that we can interconnect. I've got old players I used to coach back in Wisconsin who we're peers now in this movement. I don't see myself as, you need to listen to me because I know everything. We're peers. We're all on the front lines trying to fight this new battle. And the young people seem to have that. And I think, social media might be the way that this moves in ways that it hasn't moved in the past.
Yeah, embracing that ability to use that medium. Yeah. We got a couple minutes.
Matt, before you move on, Matt, can I say something?
Yeah, go for it.
Frank really brought up a point that I want to stress, because he said history was important to teach. And what has happened, and I've seen this being a teacher in the school system for a while, but our curriculum has changed. And history is not taught in the elementary schools per se as a course, our social studies like it was. So much attention is put on reading and math and the core curriculum that it has gotten overlooked. And how can you understand or teach young people how to grow up and to learn to get along with their brothers and sisters if they don't understand where they come from? Everyone's history is important, and that's something we need to look at getting back to make sure that American history, because Black history is American history. Yeah. All history needs to be taught in the schools, and it needs to be more emphasis put on it.
Absolutely. Lee, final comment, answer that question.
Listen to these people. I mean, listen to folks that have a tremendous life that they've lived and experience that they've had. Everybody on this panel, with the exception of me, has seen so much and done so much. And so, my encouragement is, I think that Paul is right, that the voice of young people on social media is incredibly powerful right now. But I would sure hope that young people would, wait a few beats and listen and really pay attention to what's being said from folks that, I mean, listen to John Lewis. You know, his voice is all over the place right now with his passing this past weekend. Listen to folks who they gave their entire lives to pursuing justice, and take your cues from them before you shoot off in whatever trajectory seems right to you.
Yeah. Well, you know, we've got a number of comments in the comment section, and you know, we've been on an hour and a half, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. But you know, I'm sure that this will not be the last time that we do this. You know, we'll be doing a series over the next several weeks. Next week, Lord willing, we'll be talking about criminal justice and how, you know, that intersects with race historically and in the present. And we'll talk about a number of other issues. You know, we've had to kind of have a 3,000-foot view, you know, tonight and try to hit a lot of different areas. And I want to thank all of you for doing that graciously and speaking to these things so honestly. And so, you know, we're going to take a look at, you know, those questions that have come up in the comment sections, and we're probably going to do this again, maybe with some of these folks, maybe with some different folks. But we're going to try to get those questions answered because we want to move our community forward in a unifying way. And so I want to thank everybody. I want to thank all of our panelists, Paul, Lee, Wendy, Frank, for doing this and being here tonight and engaging with us. I want to thank the audience for watching and for participating. And, you know, please, we have a film showing at Southside on Saturday night, about 8:15. We'll be showing Free State of Jones, which talks about some of the very issues and deals with some of the things we've discussed tonight. And so we'll be doing that film screening Saturday night. And then again, next Thursday, 6 o'clock, we'll be back here again on time, this time without hopefully any technical difficulties. And we'll go from there. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate you
Matt.
helping us.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Good night.